Welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. This podcast is a production of Elevate, an online learning platform for fundraising event professionals. We're coming to you today from the studios of the AV department. Please welcome our hosts, Kristen Steele and Samantha Swaim.
Hello, and welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. We today are going to talk about something that I think is the bedrock of why we do events.
Yeah.
And that is building community. And we're here today with a community expert in so many ways, which we're going to get into and talk about, Kim Fountain. When we think about events, we think actually about creating space. And creating space has a literal implication, but it also has a bigger figurative, emotional implication, and the idea of belonging. Because without space, being able to feel like you belong doesn't happen.
Right.
And the expert on this in our world is here with us today. So I'm going to have Sam introduce.
Well, I'm
Yes.
so grateful because, Kim, you embody community in so many layers. So Kim Fountain is the Deputy CEO of the San Diego LGBTQ Community Center. And Kim is also an anthropologist. And so we have this layer of understanding group dynamics and understanding how people move through community. You also have managed and run many community centers. You and I first met when you were at a community center in Vermont, and then you were in a community center in Chicago, and now you're in San Diego. So this has been your life's work, and you are a frontline fundraiser. So if we're talking to fundraisers about building community, I can't imagine anyone better to be with us to do that, and someone I just love working with, and I'm so grateful that you're here. Kim Fountain, welcome to the Fundraising Elevator.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And I will tell you, when we met all those years ago at CenterLink at a conference, I thought, I have got to work with Sam Swaim. I've got to. And the idea, and then, being able to finally do that and to work with your entire team to create those spaces where people feel like they can bring their authentic selves into those spaces and we get some good fundraising done. It was like magic.
Well, I feel so lucky that we get to do that.
Yes, me too.
Well, I think we in the event space and you and I have done 2 events together, and we have seen this need for reconnection, that there is a big community desire for folks to be reconnecting, re-engaging in the world, finding their people. And big question, I wanted to talk to you about your thoughts on why is this so important? Why is community and connection at the heartbeat of what's driving folks right now?
Because it's in those spaces that we create, whether it is a community center space or an event space, or even better, an event space for a community. What ends up happening is that you get people who come together, and when you have everybody in the same space thinking a similar thing, which is, this space is for me. Mm-hmm. This space, it doesn't exist out there in other places that I am. Even when people are kind to me and they are good to me, it's not the same as being with your people, And when you're in those spaces, it's bigger than yourself because you're sharing it with all kinds of people. And when that happens, there's an amazing energy where you realize that things are possible. Mm-hmm. Our dreams are possible. Our hopes are possible. And for a half a minute, you get to stop expending a lot of energy just trying to get through your day and trying to navigate the relentless oppressions that we face on the daily, especially if you're an individual who lives at those sort of intersections of identities. I'm lesbian, I'm, Asian, I come from a working class background, all these different things that are always under attack. If I can be in spaces meant for me, that value me, that are created for me, I then get to be creative. I get to be, I get to think about building. I get to think about visioning. And that happens even when I'm a guest at an event, right? You just can't help yourself but let that creativity flow. So
I'm wondering, I love what you said about the spaces for me. Mm-hmm. And I think, as a queer person, I don't feel like I'm in spaces always that are designed for me.
Right.
Like, we could go on. But anyway, we're all clear on what I mean.
Should we talk about bathrooms?
No,
Yeah.
I'm good. Bane of my existence. But there's sort of the feeling of possibility as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's that next layer when all of us as individuals in that space feel possibility. What does that possibility look like? Because that's the thing that, I think why we're in events, why you're in community centers. Like, what is possible when we're all we're vibing at that level together? What does that look like?
Yeah. They say that one of the real positive arguments for having diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging spaces is that when you get that much diversity at the table, you end up with just a better product, if you will, a better, something that really takes into account so much more than you would if you were just you by yourself. Mm-hmm. And so when you're in those community center spaces, when you're in those event spaces, and the feeling is bigger than you, and you're talking to other people about what was your day like? How did you get here? How did you connect to this organization? Right? You hear the diversity of opinions. You hear the, different reasons, different ways that people might approach a topic. And from that, you build, you create, and you create joy. And, there's this wonderful saying, and so when I was doing some field work, I was doing it in the Presbyterian Church USA. And, one of the wonderful speakers said to me, there's nothing that an oppressor hates more than a happy oppressed person, and this is what these spaces create. They create joy, and we need to recharge our batteries. Right? We need to have that confirmation that, when you're alone and you're just trying to get this work done, you feel like you're the only person. That is exhausting. When you're in those other spaces and you're creating and you're finding all those whys, suddenly you're re-energized. Right? Suddenly you feel like, that's right. I'm part of something bigger than myself. I am part of a movement. I am part of creating for next generations and for making certain that the generations that came before me, that they get to go into their old age comfortably. Right? So, they don't have to go back into the closet, things like that. So you just feel like you're just part of something creative and beautiful. And that just makes all the difference in the world. It lets us go on for the rest of the year doing what we do,
Well, and I think what's interesting too about that is sometimes it's that those spaces are doing that, not just stepping out of what isn't a space for them and doing it. They're doing it in spite of, which brings a different energy. It's not like we're not trying to create just this parallel track. It's like, how do we use one to inform the other and do it not in spite of, but in addition? Like, there's a cumulative effect to that.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference too across some generations, not to sound cliche, but I think that you and I do things in spite of a lot of times, right? We're just like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. And some of the younger generations I'm seeing go into these spaces because they deserve those spaces, right? Because that space is meant for them as it should be meant for them.
Yes.
And I'm not saying, that's a, very broad generalization.
Totally.
But I love it. Do you know what I mean? I love that, there's that sense, whether it be because people are connected differently across social media, or that our movement has grown for the LGBTQ movement. It has grown enough so that there is this expectation that should happen, And that's one of the ways, we're going to talk a little bit about, how community centers have changed. And that is one of the change moments, that we think we should be at tables now, which is different.
That's powerful.
That's so powerful.
That's so beautiful. There's a couple things you've said that I think are so beautiful to highlight. And I have a story that kind of highlights all of them, but you talked about the importance of building joy, of feeling like you have a seat at the table, of diverse voices in the room, and creating that sense of being a part of something bigger, which I think those are all really beautiful things that move me and inspire me to do the work and continue to invest in the energy of community building. And in your 50th anniversary gala that was last year for the center, there was a moment. Now, when I'm on an event site and I'm in like full go mode, I'm just troubleshooting and looking 10 minutes ahead. Like, what do I need to make sure is about to happen? How do I connect to each person to make sure that everyone's in their right place and that any, problems
You're
are being
stage managing.
Any problems are being solved before they even happen, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm out on the balcony getting ready to try to blow open the doors and usher in 800 people into a ballroom. And we had coordinated a flash mob moment where we had a choir that was like a show choir. So they're used to performing while they sing. So dancing and singing together. And they came out into the crowd dressed like the crowd. And all of a sudden the music started and they started singing. And the entire crowd joined them. Now, they weren't just singing anything. They were singing ABBA. They were singing Dancing Queen, which you want to talk about generations. Like, that cut across all generations. I was shocked. The entire room joined in. And I didn't have to try to usher 800 people into the ballroom because they just followed. And there was this explosion of joy and this explosion of excitement about what we were just about to do as we head into the ballroom and get ready for the program. And then that came back to me full circle. This summer, we were celebrating a birthday and traveling with a group of friends, and we were in Amsterdam, and it was Pride weekend. And they had a women's dance party that we just happened to be peripherally walking by. And all of a sudden, I heard this explosion of joy, just like 800 people singing and bouncing up and down together and singing, of course, ABBA, as you do, and immediately turned to the group we were traveling with and started telling them about the experience at the San Diego Center, which led to a conversation about the mission and the impact and the work. So that experience, that sense of community is something that we then take with us, and we can go out into the world and be the evangelist for the work you're doing every day. And you don't have to pay the 800 guests to be out there talking about you because they love and appreciate through this connection. So I think that there's something really powerful in that. Like, we create joy, builds a movement and creates a movement, something bigger than us. I want to ask you specifically about safe space, because that's something that community centers were founded for. There's been a lot of talk lately about what are the safe spaces we need to be creating and their value. And I'm curious just about, like, what is possible when we're intentional in that way of designing safe space for specific communities?
Yes. So safe spaces has become one of those difficult phrases or concepts to really fully grasp. And for a while, people went in this one direction where, like, safe space was that you get to be who you want to be, which is wonderful. You bring your authentic self, wonderful. And you get to behave in any way you want to, not so wonderful. Right. And so, and that anybody who would challenge that is being oppressive to you. And again, not so wonderful. So then we had to rethink, what do we mean by safe spaces? Right. And I tend to think of, And I tend to think of safe spaces as places that we can show up as our authentic selves. That is not a matter of being tolerated. And it's not a matter of being tokenized, but it's a matter of being respected, right? We're going to respect each other in those spaces where we are bringing in our authentic selves. And usually the only way that can happen is if those safe spaces are co-created or created fully by the community that it is a safe space for.
Got it. Yeah.
And that is one of the things that I love about working with you all, is that you understand that. It really helps when you're doing the fundraising part of it, where you are, like we talked about earlier, stopping doing all that energy toward, navigating and negotiating harm to being creative and visionary. When you all come in and you talk to us about what did we want for that gala, for instance, we wanted joy, we wanted celebration, we wanted to create the safe space for everybody to be in there, so safe that they could, in their gayest, most fabulous self way, sing to Dancing Queen.
Yeah.
Right? Out in the open. Gay it up as much as you possibly can. If you were an ally, you were right there with us, right?
Yep.
You were right there being an ally with us. And that kind of creation of safe space is vital, because if our community only focuses on the struggle and the despair and the attacks by our own government or the attacks by, our neighbors, we lose.
Yeah.
You've got to have those safe places in which to celebrate and in which to strategize then, so when the party's over, people could still come back to the center and strategize in a safe space.
Yeah.
Right. They could come back and take all of that energy and say, okay, now we're going to make sure that we're going to fight for our communities.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you when you're talking about safe space. I'm kind of having this light bulb moment that sort of my register for that as a guest in spaces is, am I experiencing the space from the inside out or from the outside in?
Yeah.
And as soon as I'm experiencing it from the outside in and am trying to make inside line up with something that's coming at me from outside, all of a sudden that authentic self piece isn't fully articulated.
I start to think too about all the ways that shows up in event design.
Yeah.
And, that's where our focus is
absolutely.
so much. But all of a sudden, it has to do a lot of what Paul Zak talks about, which is immersion in an event, meaning being able to be fully present and participate completely in an event requires psychological safety. Where you feel like there's clarity about how to participate and understanding. And as a planner, so often it comes down to the little things like, is it easy to find? Can guests navigate there? When they navigate there, do they see a friendly face that greets them?
Yep.
Are they dressed were they communicated to about the attire and are they dressed to the event? Do they see people they know? Is it easy to get to the bar or is there an obstacle to get to the bar? Is there already clear understanding that this is a fundraising event, or are we surprising them in the moment? Those pieces help us think about, like, the macro to me is creating a safe environment where people can live their most truest, authentic selves. But we can do that in specific location and then even for specific moments in time. And I think that can really change how people participate and engage in the world in general.
Yeah, totally. Kim, do you find that when folks can trust the safe space that risk is possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, sometimes we think about risk only in the negative, right?
Yeah,
like
as an adverse thing. Yeah.
Right. I risk going outside as a queer person and being harmed in some way if I'm, to something or another, right? Whatever that means, right? But risk can be generative, right? It can be exciting. It can be, and so when we think about risk in terms of, being at an LGBTQ event, for instance, and being in those spaces, walking through the doors of an LGBTQ community center to find each other, those can be so generative in that they can create exactly the moment that sparks your passion about getting involved and moving your community forward.
Yeah.
And that's critical, because everybody wants to talk to us about, we are problematic, we are sinful, we are, destroying the, fabric of American society. And when you're fighting those concepts all the time and you walk in and somebody says, so happy to see you, so happy you're here. Hey, do you want to get involved? Well, you want me to be involved? Sure, I'm there, right? that risking, your sort of everyday way of doing things and going out and trying something new is super exciting, right? That can change worlds.
Yeah. I also think that the opportunities through gathering together, whether it be with like-minded individuals, like finding our people, or maybe even being able to connect to people you don't know. You talk about the idea of othering and how much, there is stigma and fighting that we're doing just for our own security and safety in the world as LGBTQ folks. And that idea that when you create that safe space, it also becomes a place where you can bring others in and invite others in. And I've seen that in your center, and I've seen that in your events. I mean, you're a voting location for a lot of people in your community, that you are a big hub in your community, that if folks have other needs, they can come and they can get support. You have food programming and culturally specific programming that I imagine how amazing it would have been as a youth to be able to say, Mom, I know you don't get me, but I want to introduce you to other people so that you understand, like, I'm not a weird thing out here. I'm the person you love and know, and here's other people that you can see and connect and interact with. And I see that over and over when I'm at the center and in your events. Like, I see allies come and they're there because they're truly an ally, but when they leave, they're an evangelist, like
what a great
believer
description. Yeah.
Well,
and it's amazing too with our youth spaces. Just for that for a minute, it's not just youth finding other youth. That's critical, but it's youth finding other adults that believe in them and want them to. And then it's connecting those adults to the adult people in their lives.
Yeah.
Right. So we make sure that we also have time and space open for when families or, grandparents, aunties, whoever, right, can also come into those spaces and see that this other adult really values that kid. Right. And that is because we start at age 10 for our services. And you have a 10-year-old walking into that space and they're just happy because first of all, asking a 10-year-old to explain who they are.
Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes it's so clear and you're like, wow, kid, I wish I were you when I was at 10.
I'm 50 and still challenged. So there's that. Yeah.
Right. And that is the thing, right? So, there's other people around them who can do that work for them.
Yeah.
Right. That we're not asking 10-year-olds to do work that we have trouble doing ourselves. So that's super important to be able to sort of offer in the world as well.
Yeah.
Well, before we take a break, I want to just ask, when we do this work in intentionally creating community, how does that impact fundraising?
Well,
since you sit in both worlds.
One of my favorite questions. Right? Because to me, and again, going straight to the cliche, fundraising is about the why.
Yeah.
Right? It's always about the why. If you can't explain why you are doing what you're doing and why you are asking for, support, then you're just going to be giving people dry facts and figures. You're going to be giving them the how. This is how we do it. This is, and yay, hooray, we offer housing. We offer that, right? But if you can't get to the why, that, my staff is sometimes the first person that that a youth sees after waking up for the first time, having been kicked out of their home.
Yeah.
And that person and the emotional connection they make with that youth is going to be a vital part of that youth's ability to thrive into the future. Right? If I can tell that why we need staff, why we need support, that makes all the difference. And so that intentionality of creating spaces, right? Of creating very intentional spaces for your community, whether they be LGBTQ, whether they be cancer survivors, whether they be, folks with disabilities, whatever the community is, you got to get to the why, and you get to the why when you create those intentional spaces. And when you create those intentional spaces, you get stories that just blow your mind because people are just talking about who they are and what they are and why this is important to them.
Well, let's take a pause. We'll be back with Kim Fountain talking about community building.
Unleash the power of events to energize your donors and amplify your mission. Join us at the Elevate Conference in 2025, where you'll learn the essential tools for planning a successful fundraising event. Book your tickets now for March 12th and 13th. This dynamic hybrid conference, hosted at Avenue in Portland, Oregon, and streamed live for our virtual audience, will equip you with practical tools, demos, and templates that you can put to work immediately. Don't miss out. Secure your spot today at Elevate 2025. Visit elevatenonprofit.com to register now. Elevate Conference 2025 is brought to you by Swim Strategies and the AV Department, powered by elevatenonprofit.com.
Well, before the break, we were talking about the design and intentionality of creating safe space, of creating intention of building community, giving people a place to lean in. And in this past election cycle, we saw something really unique and that I don't think I've ever seen. I've been involved in political advocacy for most of my career, and I don't think I've ever seen this type of demographic sort of slicing and dicing around community building intentionally. Perfect example, white dudes for Harris, Republicans for Harris, chefs for Kamala. There have been so many different delineations of specific demographics. I'm curious a little bit about the intentionality of creating safe space for a specific audience. What happens when you curate the gathering, curate the people that are participating?
Mm-hmm. That question brings me into two very different directions.
Okay.
Love it.
On the one hand, yes, you want those very specific spaces because it is within safety that, we can really dig deep and say, like, I'm just going to pull up a whole bunch of reasons that I want to be in this space. And they may make sense to some folks, maybe not to others, but this is really why I want to be here. And I know that I don't have to explain that to the people who are going to be in the space.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't have to constantly explain who you are or why you're there when it just sort of is a given, even if it's not exactly aligned. Like, you might have dudes for Harris who are there for slightly different reasons, but you're white dudes for Harris, right? That's who you are. And then you just you start from a very different place in your organizing, right?
Yes.
You start from a very different place in your fundraising when you're in those very highly curated spaces. And that's a gift. That is a gift that most of us don't walk into those spaces and get to start from that level.
Yeah. It's true.
That's true.
Right. And the other direction that it takes me is to what you said earlier, Sam, when you said about bringing different people into spaces, right? So that you never know who's in that space with you.
Yeah.
Right. You just never know. And so we sometimes in movement building, especially around identity, make these grand generalizations, right? There's no way a white dude would want to do anything for Harris, right? There's no way that a Republican would want to do something for Harris, for instance. And yet there they are, right? They are in those spaces. And they're in the space with you. Right? And so that's really important to remember, Brett, that, you just never know who you're going to attract into these curated spaces. And it can be really exciting because then if there's 5 of them in a space, they're like, let's go do this together. Right. And so suddenly you've got this larger complex space and this group of people finds each other and then they move off and they start doing this more curated space. That's amazing. Right. You just want to keep generating those different supportive communities.
Well, and those different supportive communities, those kind of slices of things, I feel like there's a generative piece in their space, but then there's a generative piece. There's a generative piece for the whole too that happens as a result of that. That if we kind of continue with this idea, and I personally was like, wow, look at all these, what in some spaces we would call affinity groups, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of this caucusing that's happening among these identity groups. I all of a sudden look at the whole of, we have specific goals, but there's a uniting arc for all of us, right? And we're all pushing in one direction, however it is that we push, whatever that paddle looks like, all those things, that all of a sudden I see the whole very, very differently.
Yes.
Well,
the allyship, right?
Yeah.
Allyship.
That to me is the crux of movement building.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of research by Paul Slovic that has done a deep dive into the individual versus the many.
Right.
And in the fundraising world, when we talk about the individual story, we can move people much further. When we talk about the many, it's very hard to make a case that you can have impact on that. People feel disenfranchised. They feel, I can't solve this issue. But the opposite is true in movement building, that once you have that personal connection in that story and you see yourself aligned with it, you may feel like you're alone out there doing the work. But when you see all these other affinity groups coming together, now you feel like you are a part of something. Right. And that belonging to me is what sustains people. It's the thing that keeps people invested. It's very easy to check out and say, I can't do this anymore if you feel like you're the only one rolling the rock up the hill. But if you have a whole team that's standing there cheering and giving you Gatorade and subbing out and rolling the rock up the hill, now we're able to get the rock up the hill, right?
Totally. Absolutely. But it also, it also has another effect on the oppressor, right? And so the oppressor relies on stereotypes, right? They've got to stereotype so that they can dehumanize and they can splinter off, and then they can make you fight for the smallest bit of everything, right? And they're gonna pit you against each other, while they have this much, and they're gonna make you fight for this much. What ends up happening is they see that, wait, you're a Republican. How are you for this group? Wait, you're a white guy. How are you for this group? Right? I don't understand. So we also sort of rattle their ability to oppress. Affinity is, working collaboratively is so important in those moments.
Well, I feel like community centers have evolved a lot, and I'm curious about in that sort of in light of that, and sort of that idea of when we bring people into affinity, what is the role now of community centers? How is that evolution, that change, sort of impacting the work of what you do?
We went through a really interesting moment with community centers, I think. So, like you mentioned, I've done this in New York City, Vermont, Chicago, and San Diego, right? So I've done this all the different places, right across the country.
Little loop.
Right? And what I noticed is that, and a lot of times it's related to funding, especially, we advocated to get government funding. We produce the data, we produce the reasons why we should be funded. We, large foundations, large government grants. And suddenly you had community centers doing a lot of direct services, right? We're providing housing, we're providing food security, we're providing HIV services, right? And then we're slicing those into like for seniors, for youth, for the Black community, for Asian communities, right? So we're lots of services, lots of direct services, super important. And for a little while, we started to lose the community part of that. And what we've realized, especially since about, say, let's just put it at around 2016, we realized that we needed to bring the community back into the center in a way that built community power. Really looked at how do we use our spaces and the access around direct services and the understanding of what services we need for health and wellness. And we couple that, or we package that up, I should say, with this idea of power building within community. And that's how we've changed, I think. We've, we have at the San Diego Center a really large hall. It looks like an old time, like a 1950s school gym, right? It's an old union hall. So I would say it's got great energy in there. And in that space, we have done in the past, I'd say 6 months, we have done everything from, 6 to 10 months, maybe like Lunar New Year, Red Hot Women's Dance. We've done memorial services and celebrations of life, and we've held decriminalize sex work conferences, and we've held sachet you play board game nights. So we're filling the spaces with 100, 200 people who are coming to do this, and then we say to them, hey, anybody want to do phone banking? Do you want to come to our trivia night for people who want to do door knocking, for our nonpartisan work around get out the vote? Do you want to do that? And then people are like, sure, I'll do that, and suddenly you are building advocacy into the joyful moments, So, I mean, or even in the moments where we're mourning, there's all kinds of spaces that community centers will, bring folks together for. And we, like I said, then we can say, you might also want to do these things as well. So we've been able to maintain our advocacy work year round. So a lot of different folks will do, we're going to organize during voting season, right? Whenever that might be. And then something big happens, you're like, wait, we still need to mobilize community when all of a sudden we've got a bunch of hate legislation coming down the pike, or we have, a particularly terrible attack against our community, or we get something really wonderful that happened in community, right? We still need to gather. And so what our advocacy team has been able to do is they've kept the volunteers in the community involved all year in different ways. And so that's really changed how we do a lot of our work.
Well, you're continuing to put opportunities in front of folks that you've built relationship with.
Yeah.
And so while folks might have one entry point, like, yes, put me down for bingo or whatever that is, they may not know the extent of ways they could be involved in what that could look like. Or all of a sudden, because of the collective power in the room and the community they're feeling a part of, that makes sense to them in a different way, which is the potential, I think, in general of events. It's like I come in one way, but based on what experience I have in that space, it can change my engagement and what that potentially looks like.
Yeah.
And I think the key word in there was relationship.
Yeah.
Right? We build relationship with people. And, maybe it's my lesbian self that I have to build a relationship with everybody and everything. But, it is so important to do, give people a reason to show up, because you are there, you are a relationship that they value.
Yeah.
If we were to kind of extrapolate that or kind of kick that out a little bit for, a little bit broader framework for some of the organizations that are listening in today, what can others garner from the work of community centers? Like what pieces of that or threads they can pull through if they're like, we don't have a physical space that we gather people that they can come to regularly, or those pieces, what are things they can take away from this instead of like, nope, don't have space, can't do it?
Yeah, you can gather anywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And that is the thing, right? Is that, you just have to be intentional about it. A lot of community centers didn't start with space. They started with people.
Yeah.
And people who wanted to gather for a reason. And oftentimes it was in living rooms and in kitchens and in church basements, at YMCAs, at, all these different places, veterans halls, right? All kinds of different places. There are spaces that exist and you can gather. And now, lo and behold, it is 2024, we can gather online.
Right.
And there's nothing better than being in person, but you can still gather online. And so there are different ways to do it. And I think what you take away from a community center is that, the whole that is created, is much bigger than the sum of its parts, right? Like you create ideas and passions and movement building by gathering. You don't do it alone. The ideas have got to spark from individual to individual. It's in the definition of movement, if you will, and so I think that's what they learn. And you also learn from community centers, don't despair, right? Use your power to do something about it, right? Where we heard that recently, do something about it, right? And that is, it's so important, and it's easier to get motivated to do something if the person next to you is also doing something.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
true.
And that's why gathering is important, right? It is why getting together is key, because that kind of, the excitement that it builds. A lot of people, for instance, don't like door knocking, right? They're not going to say, I love going up to strangers' doors and knocking and talking to them about something they may be a little cranky about. Right. But if you've got your door knocking buddies with you, then what ends up happening is, like, for us, they tell the story of, they went and they door knocked and this person came to the door and she was like, oh my goodness, it's the center. Hey, honey. And she called her wife over and she was like, come and see, it's the center. Right. So they got to experience that collective joy together. And then you go out and you talk about it together later. Right. It's, it is that sort of, I get to share that joyful feeling with other people. When you see a movie that you love, if you're just sitting there and you're like, there's nobody to talk to about it, but if you see a movie you love with a group of people and you're all chatting about it, it's that same energy for door knocking, right?
Yeah.
Or for phone banking, or for, whatever, putting on a conference or a talk, it's that same energy.
So I think during the pandemic, there was this surge of community coming together, even though we're isolated. And then there was this time where people were just isolated. And I think we have a lot of healing and recovery to do from that. But it has definitely brought forth all of those emotional connections of what is possible when we're together. And I think that the idea of door knocking feels foreign to a lot of people because it feels like I'm going to talk to strangers. I don't even see my family these days, that there is a bigger call to action, I think, right now around coming together. But if we were to talk to other organizations that don't have location, but they're looking together, how do you lean into social theory to adapt space for your own communities, your own purpose, your own design needs?
And I think it depends on, so for the LGBTQ community, it's the one I'm most familiar with, for instance.
Yeah.
When we talk, what we do is, like I said, it's about co-creating space, right? Or the group of folks for whom the space is needed need to create that space, right? So there's got to be something in there, right? Where the space speaks to the people. And I have to ask myself, am I going to create a space in a church basement where some of my folks may feel like their communities of worship have been harmful to them?
Right.
So I might be thinking about that. Or I might be looking at spaces and I might need to tell the person who owns the space or who runs the space, hey, we're going to put signs over your men and women's room and we're going to say gender neutral bathrooms. So I want to make sure your staff is comfortable with that. I need to make sure your staff is going to be okay with the fact that we've got these signs up and nobody's going to take them down.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of spaces that I'm talking about in terms of creating, the actual physical space has to resonate with the group that you want to bring into that space.
We have in the past had security at events. And as we all know, there's a lot of communities where an armed or a uniformed officer is a threat. It's not a comfort. And oftentimes the intention is hiring security for comfort and not the opposite.
Right.
And we were working with an organization several years back. This is probably 5-6 years ago now, but they really had this vision that they wanted to be very thoughtful. Their keynote speaker was someone who had had some threats, and they wanted to be very careful and thoughtful about security, but they also knew that didn't create a welcoming environment. And so we reached out and actually engaged drag queens to be our security team, because there is a direct sassiness about drag queens that they would be able to diffuse any conflict or confrontation. And they owned that role. They had a great time in that role. And it was an intentional choice that added some joy and brought some fun to the event, but also helped to create a safer environment without us having to, with the intention of us thinking about the community that was there. So I love the idea of the intentionality when designing space for folks.
Yeah.
Super important. Super important.
The idea of space building, sort of on the more metaphorical level, I think for a lot of organizations out there is a quote unquote nice to have, right? As a pathway to their work. And I'm trying to think too about how to sort of open some of this up for other organizations with missions that are in tandem, but also that might be working in different spaces, giving them some ideas that maybe they can noodle on. Can you talk a little bit about how space building impacts mission or has the potential to impact mission?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a bunch of social theory out there.
I love it. Let's go.
About space as being public space, as being marked as white, as being marked as heterosexual, as being marked, right. So that anybody who moves through spaces as none of those things, and you just go any of the binaries, you're right, heterosexual or queer, it's heterosexual, people of color and white, it's going to be white. So whatever the sort of, dominant, more powerful group is, that's what the space is marked as. And what ends up happening is we know how to navigate those spaces, as individuals who sort of just do it all our lives. Some of us rail against it and we're sassy. Others of us sort of try to blend into the space as much as possible. When you're creating space, like for instance, at our center, we also have to look at who's in leadership at the center. And we have to ask ourselves, what parts of those binaries are we replicating being in leadership? Right? What kind of decisions are we making as an organization that potentially replicates spaces that are harmful to others? So that's one thing you have to think about. The other thing you have to think about is that you are there to serve the community. And the community doesn't mean that you try to figure out who is the absolutely most oppressed person in our entire community, and everything goes toward making certain that that space reflects that single individual or that single, identity. And you might think it should, right? But welcome to community building, right? Welcome to like space looks different and it seems different. How people enter it look different. What you want to make certain that you do is that everybody feels as welcome as possible. So at the center, what we do is we make certain that the art that we purchase from the artists, we don't just ask them like, you get to hang your art here, and so that should be why you want it to be up here. No, we understand that artists need to be paid. So we pay artists, and we pay them to have paintings that reflect the community. So you walk in and, Marsha P. Johnson's ginormous, face greets you, right? So that we make certain that we're creating spaces where, a young Black trans person can walk in and feel like, I belong here. This makes sense to me, right? And we also make certain that when you might be an old gay white man, that you walk in and you feel like this belongs to me as well. There's a tile, on the wall over there that, when I walk up onto the patio, I see it, and I donated that tile 20 years ago. Whatever it is, right? What are your touch points? When we say we are an accessible space, are we really, have we really talked to people and said, can you actually navigate this? Or have we over the years put a chair someplace we shouldn't have, or created a door so heavy you can't get through it? Or, whatever it is, is the corner not actually someone you can navigate? We installed coils in the space so that if you have a certain kind of hearing aid, you can connect to this hearing coil.
Oh,
and that was really important for us. But then we realized that hearing coils don't work as well in an acoustically horrible auditorium. So we have to fix that issue. There's a lot of these moments where, you just have to make certain that everything you do is intentional, and you don't get yourself into a space where when somebody's telling you how your space does not reflect them or your space harms them in some way, you cannot get into a place where you start to get defensive.
Yeah.
Right? It's so important when you work in and with community that you are able to hear people say to you, you've gotten this wrong, right? Even if somebody with similar situations in life or similar identities just yesterday told you it was the perfect space and thank you so much, you get it right. And then the next person says, oh, you got this so wrong, right? The key isn't to just constantly having to change everything. It's to get into dialogue with people about what is the space? What are you trying to do with the space? And, oh, right, you know what? I didn't think about that. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry you had to do the labor to educate me on this, but we're going to start tackling that problem.
What a lovely, gracious way to accept that new knowledge.
So yeah, it's super important, right? I mean, you just want everybody who walks in to feel as comfortable as possible. And sometimes the comfort might be to be able to tell you you've gotten it wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
One of the design choices at the center that I love so much is that you have very specific, like culturally specific services that you offer. And one of the culturally specific programs that you offer is for the Latinx community. And you have a space that when you enter that space, one, it's like culturally representative, but also the first thing that you hear and see in that space is not necessarily, white dude for Harris. That what you hear and see in that space is language you understand, are culturally specific, room designs and choices. And I just appreciate the intentionality of what that allows for people then to feel psychological safety and lean in and participate and grow the work they're doing and grow the mission so that they do feel like they're a part of something.
Yeah. I mean, there's an opportunity for your mission to infuse 360 degrees of what you're doing. And I think, well, I just said that and somebody keeled over in their chair because that sounds so overwhelming. I think it's important to start to think about pick one way.
Yeah.
Pick one way and one thing you can start thinking about. And then you kind of bring the rungs of the ladder into place. I think that's great. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to ask Kim to join us in the fundraising elevator.
We've been partnering with Greater Giving for over 20 years as our go-to event auction software. Greater Giving allows us to do our job, planning fundraising events, even better because we can manage guest lists, seating, bid number assignments, and sales all in one place.
That makes it great for our nonprofit partners and their guests. Check out Greater Giving for your next event at greatergiving.com. Link in the show notes.
All right, welcome back. Let's jump in the fundraising elevator where we're all headed up. Kim, I want to know, what is a tool or a story or a little bit of sage advice that you would have for our fundraising superheroes out there so they can keep heading up?
It's something that I bring my board through each year, and it is the 5 whys, right? And you go 5 whys deep. So it would be something like, why do you want to be part of the center? And it might be, because it's important for LGBTQ folks to have supportive spaces. Why? Because LGBT people face relentless messaging and questions about who we are and how awful we are. Well, but why? Right. And it's because in these LGBTQ spaces, where people are trained to hear our words as we intend them, who value us and who understand us, they can best support us. Why? Because if you don't have this, people may face greater harm. But why? Right. And you just keep going, why and why and why until you get to that. It's like, because we still live in a society where LGBTQ folks are harmed, and these harms are ramping up. People are still isolated. They're still facing, state sanctioned attacks. We have young folks who are having a hard time coming out, and older folks who are going back into the closet. Right. So if you keep asking yourself why you're involved, why, right, whatever concept you start about, why are you part of the center? And if you can go 5 whys deep, you get to such a richer, more complex reason about why you do the work and why it's important and what kind of impact you'll have in the world. That I think that really helps a lot. And then you just share it out with folks, and you hear people laughing, and you hear people struggling, and you hear people being like, this is hard. And oh my gosh, but I came out with this beautiful why. And that resonates with the people that they then go ask for donations.
We peel that same onion with events and ask folks about, well, why are we gathering people? And always the first answer is,
we've got to raise $500,000.
Yeah. And then, but why? To support our community and grow our mission. But why? And when you get to the crux of it, there's layers of answers that are all correct, but you get to a much richer, centered, cumulative impact you can have. And then in our choices, we can design for those, for that impact.
Yeah. Well, and it's really, it may not feel like it in the difficult process of answering all those. It's actually really a gift.
Yeah.
It's a gift for everybody. And you're doing it with your board. I think when staff do that and you drill down, it just opens you up to really authentically talk about things. You don't need to regurgitate the mission from the website.
Right.
That was thoughtfully crafted, and drafts were done, and it got approved, and that's great. But what does that look like for you in your life and what you're passionate about?
And our donors. Every donor has 5 whys that they can peel back as to why they give.
If you're in the San Diego area and would like to connect to the center, please check out their website. We are going to put a link to that in the show notes. Kim, if folks are really interested in this topic and some of the ideas you've shared today, what are some resources you would direct them to?
I'd go to places like Nonprofit Solutions or the Association of Fundraising Professionals. But more importantly for me is actually where I met you all, which is, for us, it's going to Centerlink, right? It is going to those places where their mission is to support the larger work around either the country or the state or region, wherever you happen to be. So most folks who do work that's either identity-based or issue-based, there is some kind of an umbrella organization. And it's in those spaces that you meet other fundraisers, right? You meet other people who do this work. And so they know your community, or they know exactly why you want to run an event and why you'd want to work with certain folks who may run events, or who, because they get you and you don't have to explain yourselves to them, and they understand this is actually what, ABBA brings joy to the gay community, right? So, those kinds of moments, and so that's why, going to, conferences like Centerlink and places like this, really, I think that's where I find my best fundraising connections. But there are other folks, like I said, Nonprofit Solutions or AFP. So
yeah, and there's a couple of key things that I think people don't always know, that every state has a organization, like an umbrella organization. So look up your nonprofit association of Nevada, nonprofit association of Kansas, because there is a like statewide organizing for every state. And on that note, you actually teed up a great sort of reminder for our audience that we specifically talk to event fundraisers, and we have a gathering space, the Elevate Conference, a 2-day hybrid conference, March 12th and 13th. We hope folks will join us. You can go to elevatenonprofit.com to register. And as we head off to our family gatherings and we think about the holiday that is coming up and the season of holidays that are coming up, maybe even in your own family gatherings, you can take some of these ideas and some of these pieces about intentionality, intentional space design, maybe to make the family gathering a little easier. So hopefully there's a little pearl of wisdom. Kim, thank you for bringing your expertise and just your heart to everything you do. We adore working with you and just absolutely are inspired by the work you do every day. So thank you for sharing your time with us. It's a really incredible gift.
Thank you so much for having me and for doing this podcast. And what a gift, absolutely, as well. So thank you.
The Fundraising Elevator is produced in partnership with Swaim Strategies at the studios of the AV Department. The program is produced and directed by Steve Osborne, with audio engineering and original music by Dwayne Anderson, Heidi Christensen, and Adam Breeden. Video production by Shannon Doran. Graphic design by Pendulum Creative Group. Marketing by Lisa Aragon. Support from Mary Elizabeth, Todd Campbell, John Lyles, and Andy Dowsett. And voiceover by Josh Boykin.
Hey y'all, it's Kristen. Before we leave, I want to ask for your help to make the podcast grow. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please like, follow, and subscribe to the Fundraising Elevator. And if you're getting a lot out of the show, share it with a friend. Leave us a review. These things help make sure that the podcast continues heading up. Thanks so much for being here and tuning in.
Are you ready to engage supporters and grow your base with your own podcast? Then let us introduce you to our partners at the AV Department in Portland, Oregon. In addition to delivering exceptional live event audiovisual production and videography, they also have a top-tier production studio and an expert team ready to take your content ideas to the next level. Contact the AV Department to schedule a consultation and start bringing your podcast vision to life. Ready to take your fundraising to the next level? Need to get unstuck in your event planning? Now's your chance to connect directly with the experts behind the Fundraising Elevator. Book a one-on-one consulting session with Sam for strategic planning and fundraising strategy, with Kristen for your program and storytelling, or Mary for your registration and data tools. They're here to provide you personalized answers to all your event questions. Don't wait. Raise more at your next fundraising event. Book your session today at elevatenonprofit.com. You can also find the link in the show notes.